Hey, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and this is my April wrap-up. Okay, so April definitely took a nosedive as far as my reading goes. I fell way behind on my TBRs, and I've been working very hard to catch up. So with that being said, here are my stats. I read 10 books in April. 4 nonfiction, 1 YA, 1 fantasy romance, and 3 middle grade. I totaled 2,388 pages, averaging about 80 pages per day. So that's not awesome as far as my overall Goodreads goal for the year, which is 200 books. So even though I've been super busy for very happy reasons, I do attribute some of the blame here to some of these books on this list, which were disappointing, and that was surprising. So let me tell you about them. In YA, I read Fire by Kristin Cashore. This was our book club pick of the month as we were trying to read the entire Graceling series, and this was an interesting experience. Fire is about a girl named Fire who is a monster. In this world, there are regular animals and regular humans and monster humans, which are very rare, and Fire is actually the last monster human. So Fire has the ability to read the minds of other humans, and she doesn't really do this, or she refuses to do this because she believes that it's wrong and unethical. And she doesn't want to turn into her father, who was a bad guy. But she meets a prince who needs her power to uncover a treasonous plot. So throughout the book, she grapples with the ethics of fully stepping into her power. Okay, so I gave this book 3.5 stars, rounding up to 4, despite all of my issues with the book. This is a very intrigue-heavy plot, so not a very dynamic or sweeping plot. In this way, I did prefer the first Graceling book because it felt much more like an epic journey, whereas in Fire, we spend the majority of the story in the same town, in the same location, and much of the plot advances through dialogue. But I took issue with the character of Fire herself and the way that she was depicted. And I go into a lot more detail in this in my strong female protagonist video, which I'll link to right up here. But essentially, Fire is a predator. And because of this, people see her as a threat, obviously. And part of her monstrous or predatory power is that she's seen as very alluring. So very thick, bold, luscious red hair, a very syrupy, sweet voice, think like Siren. So because of this, people are inherently drawn to her. And as a monster, her blood is extremely appealing to other monster animals. So she basically has to quarantine herself during her period every 4 weeks. So she's never safe. Her entire consciousness is consistently split between furthering her own goals and living her life, and being constantly aware of her own existence, which is threatened at every turn. Men either want to attack her and rape her because she's alluring, or they want to attack her and kill her because she's a threat. So Cashore just essentialized the general female experience of how women are constantly aware of how our existence affects men and then trying to protect ourselves from it, which maybe wouldn't have been so hard to tolerate, but that Cashore gave the female protagonist the huge weakness in her own period, which makes her all but useless and basically deactivated for an entire week out of the month. So like I said, major issues. And yet, it wasn't altogether unpleasant to read. The reading experience wasn't horrible, and Cashore has a really well-developed world. And I think that the plot structure would appeal to many fantasy readers. So, 3.5 stars. In fantasy, I read Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. Obviously, I wanted to read the Shadow and Bone series this month in anticipation of the extremely exciting Netflix show, which I've heard so many good things about, but I only made it through the first book and halfway through the second book. So Shadow and Bone is about Alina, who discovers that she has powers, specifically very rare light conjuring powers, making her a sun summoner. And this ability makes her the only person who is able to banish the Shadow Fold, which is an all-encompassing darkness between territories. But as she learns more about her powers, she discovers that she might only be a small part of a much larger plot. 5 stars. This book was a super well-constructed fantasy, hitting every plot point of the Chosen One trope. Everything from the denial to the training montage to the epic climax, and it even made time for a plot twist. But my favorite part about this book was the very strong emphasis that Bardugo placed on Alina needing to be her own person and fully realizing herself and acknowledging herself before being able to connect to her power. I read several nonfiction books this month, and on the spiritual side of things, I read Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, which is the definitive text on Taoism. So, Taoism isn't a religion, it's more of a spiritual practice, and it's rooted in contentment, simplicity, and honestly, just straight vibes. So, this book is full of proverbs, wisdom, and little nuggets that help depict this practice and this way of life. I gave it 4 stars, not 5 stars, because despite being a spiritual and sacred text, it's still full of sexism, so, ugh. And throughout the month, I read these little gems in Ask Baba Yaga by Tazia Kataiskai, and it's set up as a sort of advice column where people write in and ask Baba Yaga, the archetypal and fictional character of the crone witch who lives in the woods and sometimes eats children and sometimes offers life advice in the form of poetic wisdom. 5 stars, beautiful writing. And rounding out nonfiction, I read Who Moved My Cheese by Spencer Johnson. This is one of those corporate culture books that's been around forever and uses an extended metaphor to help explain a business concept or principle. This book uses 2 mice and 2 little people inside a maze to depict the different ways that employees and managers react to change in a business landscape. I gave it 3 stars. My biggest problem with these books is that they're usually written by business people, which isn't a problem with the idea, but the execution. Specifically in the knowledge of when to use extended metaphor and when to use allegory, and when to know when your extended metaphor is so exhausted that it becomes silly string, or when you start mixing metaphors inside your extended metaphor and unintentionally call your frontline employees simpletons. Future business people, if you have a brilliant idea for a book, by all means write it. Just maybe invest in a writer friend to help you out. Unrelated, all of my contact information can be found in the description box below. Moving into middle grade, I read Afternoon of the Elves by Janet Taylor Lyle. This story is about Hillary as she befriends Sarah Kate, a very weird girl at school who has messy hair and dirty clothes and says that she has an elf village in her yard. This book is 5 stars. Holy cow, I loved this book. I first read it when I was 10 and I loved it then. It's a Newbery Medal nominee and it's honestly brilliant. It offers an extremely unique perspective at the way that poverty and childhood neglect can manifest, and it captures it and then blurs it behind a backdrop of an extremely alluring fantasy world. Perfection. Also in middle grade, I read Kiki's Delivery Service by Eiko Kadano. So I got this book because I wanted to see if it lived up to the extremely high expectations I have of it because of the film, and it did not disappoint. This book is about Kiki, who has just come of age and flies to a new town of her own to establish herself as a witch. I gave it 5 stars. This book is just as charming as the film, and it depicts Kiki as she grows up and learns responsibility, encounters burnout, and discovers that the idea of being proud of yourself is more of a journey instead of a single moment. I love this book because the stakes are never super high. She's never in peril and she never experiences this great emotional trauma. She is just a young witch starting a delivery service. The last middle grade I read was The Crowns of Croswald by D.E. Knight, and this book gave me the most conflicting feelings out of any other book I read this month. So this is about Ivy, a 16-year-old who crosses the boundary into a magical world and discovers her own powers. Okay, so this book was extremely charming and delightful and whimsical. Honestly, just the most fun and immersive world. But I found it very hard to read. So very similar to Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, there's not a lot of exposition for readers outside the magical world that it's describing. So all of the exposition and explanation for objects, creatures, magical systems, and the world itself is described using in-world terminology, which makes it very difficult to follow even the very simple plot from one scene to the next. It's very similar to Harry Potter and how it all comes about. A girl gets a letter and she meets a benefactor who tells her she's going to magic school, but she doesn't have any money, so he gives her money to buy textbooks and supplies from this area of town that has all of these magic shops that have very similar Harry Potter-esque names and themes. The neat thing is this one reads really young, which I honestly found is a good thing. It skews really young and I think would be a very easy bridge for young elementary readers to make their way into a fantasy world and genre. But in that same vein, the main character does not read like she's 16. She reads like she's 11 or 12. And this isn't really a plot problem. She's not given 16-year-old challenges to face. She's given 11 or 12-year-old challenges. So in this way, it reads like she is actually 11 or 12, and the description is just a typo. I gave this 3 stars. Not because I disliked anything about the book. Honestly, I loved everything from the atmosphere to the plot, but because it was truly a difficult reading experience. I wanted so badly to understand what was happening, but the exposition was so rooted in the world that in some scenes I really couldn't make heads or tails of what was happening. And in this way, it actually became more confusing the more that I read on. And I really hated that because I didn't hate this book, and I would actually recommend it to young readers who may have more patience than I do. Naturally, I've got to end this wrap up with a romance, and a fantasy romance at that. So we're looking at Rhapsodic by Laura Thalassa. So this book is about Calypso Lillis, who's a siren, which doesn't matter, but she makes a lot of debts with the bargainer, who makes a lot of deals and always collects. But for some reason, he's allowed her to rack up like hundreds of debts, and after 7 years of ghosting her, he's come to collect. A solid 2-star read. Nothing ever matters in these books. Like, entire plot structures and directions are set up just to be completely ignored. For example, Calypso Lillis, don't worry, she goes by Callie, is a siren, as in a mermaid siren, except she's not. She's a human, and her sirenness never comes into play. Not once, so why is it a thing? And you have your absolutely classic love triangle with the self-loathing dark guy of the world, could be 20s, could be 200, and the only thing darker than his 5 o'clock shadow is his soul. And the aggressive, protective, abusive, if you look a little too closely, side boy, who in this case is, you guessed it, a werewolf. Guys, the jacket didn't say anything about werewolves. What is the point? And that's the thing, it had no point. He was only a werewolf so that he could turn into a werewolf and endanger her when he was coming to try to save her, so that the other guy could come and save her from the first guy. Seriously, what's happening here? Where are all of these fantasies coming from? And as far as the actual plot goes, from what I can tell, all these debts that Callie racked up from the bargainer, one was for helping murder his stepdad, who was a rapist, which, I get it. Except all he did was help her hide the body, so why is he there? Unclear. And the rest were literally just for hanging out. So she's in college, and she has no friends, she's lonely, and she's suffering from severe PTSD, from all the rape. And being the stand-up guy that he is, he hangs out with her and spends time with her. And they get popcorn, and they watch movies, and they play Uno, and hang out in the dorms. And for every one of those play dates, he makes her owe him a life debt in the form of these snazzy little bangle bracelets that go all the way up her arms. And then in present day, when he shows back up demanding repayment, it's to help him uncover a mystery happening back in fantasy world that has to do with a lot of demon babies. Honestly, I think my biggest problem with the book was her description of the huge bargainer demon guy. When he flies, she goes into such incredible description of his huge bat wings that honestly the only image my mind could conjure was that of Mothman. Like Jeepers Creepers. Or maybe it was just all the lack of female agency and the horrendous stereotypical depiction of the sassy black friend who only spoke in girl boss platitudes bookended with gratuitous profanity. This book has been so widely recommended, and guys, I'm trying. I feel like I would genuinely appreciate someone trying to explain this book's appeal to me. So, there we go. Those are my 10 books in April. I think we hit some major highs and major lows in there, but overall, some really good and solid books throughout April. So, your turn. Have you read any of the books that I did in April? And if so, what did you think about them? By all means, challenge my ratings, challenge my reviews. I would really love to know what you think. And then if you would be so kind as to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you loved it, and of course there's always Instagram. And in the meantime, happy reading!